Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Andre Adams. I serve as the director of 80 Bruce Religion Center on behalf of our department, our staff, our campus ministers. It's a great honor to welcome you all here today, and thank you for making time to join us for our first speaker series event of the fall semester, but really of the academic year. So 80 Bruce Religion Center's mission is to embrace, celebrate, and foster spiritual and religious experiences of the diverse University of Houston community. I hope that you discover something new today's discussion, prompting you to explore more ways to engage and learn more. While you explore, we hope that you also find some communities within this space. A community where different faiths and cultures are appreciated and everyone learns from one another. The 80 Bruce Religion Center opened back in 1965 with a vision to provide a space where the UH community can explore, learn, and join groups devoted to religion. Today we do the same, just a bit differently. We have 13 campus ministries representing different denominations and faiths. We have a number of programs like Good Morning Mondays, which is our free coffee and donut program, which we host every other Monday morning. We have our free Wednesday lunch program, which is every Wednesday at 11:30, where we openly serve the campus community, and it's graciously sponsored by a number of different groups, departments, or campus ministries. And then we have our Lego Your Stress program, which is happening right now, which is an opportunity to, which happens every Thursday, all day long in our conference room, which is an opportunity to just de-stress from the day, right? Build some Legos and make some friends. While these programs address needs like food and financial insecurities and stress management, they're also more about relationship building opportunities. The opportunity to listen, learn to others, discover new things about people, faith, and practices, which is also the primary objective of our monthly Interfaith Dialogue program and today's speaker series event. Our speaker series program aims to celebrate spiritual diversity by offering the University of Houston community a unique opportunity to delve into conversations around faith, religion, spirituality, and a framework not often explored. Today's discussion, NUNS and the changing nature of black religion in the United States, in the changing nature of black religion. In the United States, to be black American is to be black Christian. And there's something to this assumption in that vast majority of African Americans are Christian. However, recent years are marked by a growing number of African Americans who claim no particular religious affiliation, i.e. nuns. And these black nuns, the most public and vocal are those who claim to be humanist. It's surprising how little attention black humanists have received in both popular and academic publications. Based on the growth of this population of non-believers and the way their numbers are beginning to change the influence of black churches as well as black life in general, ignoring them is a mistake. What does it mean to be a black humanist? What do black humanists believe, and what do they do? Today, we will talk about that. Leading this discussion today is Dr. Anthony Penn, who joins us all the way from Rice University. As many of you know, it takes an hour to get anywhere from point A to point B in Houston, so we very much appreciate the crosstown journey. Dr. Penn is a professor working in intersections of African American religion, constructive theory, and humanist thought. At Rice University, Dr. Penn is the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities, Professor of Religious Studies, and founder and executive director of the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. He is also director of research for the Institute of Humanist Studies in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Anthony Penn.
I have studied religion professionally for 30 years now, and things have changed. As the introduction indicated, for a significant period of time, one could reasonably assume that the vast majority of African Americans you encountered were Christian. Now, they might be Mother's Day, Easter, Christmas Christians, but they were Christians. That a dominant percentage of African Americans claimed belief in God, said they knew something about the Bible, and attended church, believed in prayer, believed in higher beings, and attended church. That has changed. Over the past several decades, there has been a move away from black churches. Now think about it this way. After the Civil Rights Movement, religion, Christianity within the context of the United States faced a decline. Not just black churches, all denominations faced a decline. It's not until the mid-1980s that black churches experienced an uptick. And this uptick in large part is premised upon the return of the black middle class. These are folks who have been told, you go to the right schools, you speak the King's English the right way, you live in the right neighborhood, you dress the right way, you have the right job, and the American dream can be yours. But they quickly realize anti-black racism undercut that assumption. And not only did they continue to experience anti-black racism despite all they had done, they had given up cultural and social connections. And so black middle class begins to move back into the churches, and the Obamas represent what's happening here, this movement back into the church on one level to gain a social network, to have one's cultural sensibilities affirmed, to be somewhere where you didn't have to explain why you were angry, to be somewhere where you didn't have to worry about people without permission touching your hair. A space that was just uniquely yours and that was connected to a long period of self-exploration and development. Something about black community was tied to what took place within those denominational churches. But it's also the case that not all of these folks who were coming back to churches in the 1980s were embracing the theology. There was something about the social connection, something about the cultural connection that appealed to them. And if the sermon, the theology was the price they paid for this, then it was a price worth paying. The number of African Americans who don't say church when asked about their self-identity, their connection to something beyond their individual concerns. The number of black folks who don't say church, again, has significantly increased. And there's something about this increase that's generational. So the Pew Research Center has been doing studies for several decades now on this growing group of folks who claim no particular religious affiliation. And their most recent study indicates that 28% of black Gen Zers claim no particular religious affiliation. 33% of black millennials claim no particular religious affiliation. 11% of black baby boomers claim no particular religious affiliation. Something is shifting. Now, this isn't to say that black folks are no longer concerned with the fundamental questions of human existence. Who are we? When are we? What are we? Why are we? But how they go about wrestling with those questions fundamentally changed. So in my circles, it's not uncommon to have folks talk about this shift. But what annoys me about that conversation is the assumption that this is only something that has happened as of the mid-20th century, that prior to the mid-20th century, every black person went to church. What they fail to recognize is that there's a long tradition of disbelief within African American communities, and that what has taken place in more recent decades is an extension, a more vocal, a more public pronouncement of an attitude that is as old as the black community. Think about it this way. You're probably familiar with the spirituals, yeah? And you can't accurately date the spirituals. We don't really know when the spirituals begin to form. We don't know this. But at the same time, the blues, and don't think 1920 race records, the blues are as old as the spirituals. And then whereas the spirituals endorsed the theology that said God is on the throne and all is well, that understood black identity as essentially tied to the workings of a God who is outlined in the Bible, the blues signified those theological assumptions. And whereas the spirituals were concerned with a relationship that was vertical, flawed humans in relationship with a divine figure who is consistent, who is loving, who is kind and compassionate. The blues were concerned with horizontal relationships. What do we do in the context of our material existence? What do we make of this physicality? What do we make of these absurd circumstances that name our social world? And so moral and ethical sensibilities that were endorsed by the spirituals were critiqued by the blues. Whereas the spirituals understood this embodied body as fundamentally flawed, tying it to some version of original sin, and that our preoccupation has to be a reversing of this stain. That we, in and of ourselves, are fundamentally flawed, of no value, and then there is God. The blues celebrate the desires, the wants, the needs of this body, whereas the church, for example, had nothing to really say about issues of sex and sexuality. The blues celebrated how these bodies give and receive pleasure. And they did this in a way that was grounded in our historical moment. No transhistorical claims or desires. What takes place within the context of our physical world on this horizontal plane. This thinking continues. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe not, Alexander Crummell. Tremendous preacher, very much involved in the formation of the early black church. And Alexander Payne, another figure deeply involved in the establishment of the black church, right? And Alexander Payne argues one of the fundamental reasons Christianity has not captured folks the way it should is the problem of slavery. A country that endorses the misery of folks based upon a physical difference cannot be in line with the will of God and cannot live out the will of God. And he says, I'll give you a perfect example. He argues that as he goes through towns preaching the gospel, if he sees black folks, he asks, so where do you go to church? Right, 2024. Still asks, so what church you go to? You look Baptist. What church you go to? He says he ran into one particular young man and asked him, so what church do you go to? And the young man said, no, I don't go to church. White folks go to church, right? And whatever the white folks do doesn't work for me. And Payne says, see, this is a perfect example that here you have disbelief that is grounded in the misery that white populations cause, that white supremacy is resulting in disbelief. Now, lots of folks read that, and what they take away is simply the critique of white hypocrisy. I read this and I think, he's naming a different orientation, that within the context of the world as Daniel Payne experienced it, there were black folks who disengaged from the Christian tradition. For me, that's telling. Now, this young man didn't name himself a black humanist, that this idea of black humanism is a 20th century concept. But what you get very early on are sensibilities that are very much in line with what we mean in the 21st century by black humanism. And it's a way of thinking that captures a noteworthy percentage of African Americans who understand that they hold to no particular religious affiliation. A noteworthy percentage of black folks who respond to surveys and say, nope, I don't do that, label themselves humanist. And there's a challenge there that within the context of the United States, we don't really understand what folks mean when they say, I'm a humanist. Right? Aren't we all human? Right? Don't really understand what folks mean when they say they are humanists. Now, within the context of the United States, when folks say they are an atheist, we know what they mean. But a humanist, not so much. So this is how I would want to understand humanism, that it's based upon a set of principles. The first is a rejection or at least a suspicion concerning divinity. An outright rejection of the God concept or deep suspicion concerning how this God concept has been articulated. A profound commitment to human accountability and responsibility. And this entails a shift in terms of ethics. What ought we do in the world? For black theists who are grounded in the assumption that we labor not alone, that there is a God who gets it right when we get it wrong, ethics entails a posture that revolves around outcome-driven strategies. Civil rights movement is an example of this, outcome-driven strategies. If you've got something that is more powerful, more knowing than any human being on your side, then it seems pretty reasonable to argue that if you are in line with the will of that being, things are going to work out. We're going to be all right. But if you don't hold to that, if your argument is, look, it's just us, and we tend to mess things up, it's just us, no outcome-driven strategy, but instead an assumption that struggle in and of itself is a victory. That human history, if we read it thoroughly, does not suggest the end of injustice. It suggests the mutation of injustice. Not the end of it, the mutation of injustice. So a black humanist perspective argues that we cannot embrace outcome-driven strategies because we labor alone, and outcome-driven strategies limit creativity and imagination because you're only going to do what you assume will work. If it's not going to get you what you want, we're not going to bother with that. It limits creativity and imagination to what you can easily project as winning. Black humanism has, again, this profound sense of human accountability and responsibility with an ethical shift that, again, argues victory, if there is something we can call victory, is in the struggle. That perhaps the best we can do in the context of our social world is say no to injustice and say it with increased volume and persistence. And that if there is a win, that no to injustice makes it much more difficult to normalize the misery of those who suffer most. You can't normalize it. Can't make it a necessity. And for black humanists, that may be all we have. And for some black humanists, they pull an example of this ethical thinking from the myth of Sisyphus, right? And Sisyphus is the dude who gets in trouble, outsmarts the Greek gods, and they're not too happy about this, right? Not happy at all. So they finally get him, and they think they have figured out a way to crush Sisyphus. He's going to have a task, but it's not a task that lasts for a day, a week, a month, or a year. This task will go on forever. Sisyphus has this rock, huge rock. It's a heavy rock, and he's got to push it up this hill, knowing that as soon as he gets to the top, it's coming back down. And he's got to push it again, it's coming back down. Push it again, it's coming back down. And this is forever. And according to the Greek gods, this is going to be enough. Sisyphus is done. They have won. They've crushed him. But the philosopher Albert Camus argues, no, they get this wrong. That Sisyphus has a moment of awareness, of lucidity. And it's a moment when the rock is at the top, just before it comes back down. He has an increased sense of his circumstances. He better understands the world in which he lives, and he's not crushed by those circumstances, not defeated by those circumstances. And Camus argues one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And I think this is some of what you get in terms of the black humanist, the idea that the struggle, the ability to do the work is a celebration of our humanity. And at the end of the day, that may be all we get. And if Camus is not your dude, then maybe W.E.B. Du Bois will get it for you. And W.E.B. Du Bois, before he leaves for Ghana, he's corresponding with a friend. And he tells this friend, chin up, fight on, knowing the Negro can't win. Chin up, fight on, knowing the Negro can't win. Something about the struggle in and of itself is a win. The ability to say no to injustice, and in that way, make it more difficult to normalize the misery of communities is a win. And we just do this over and over and over again. Now, for black humanism, that is not nihilism. It's not a throwing up the hands and surrendering. It's a kind of realism, a recognition of our circumstances, a recognition of how humans have behaved over the course of history, and a recognition that what we do is create space to think and to behave differently, recognizing that those spaces will collapse, and that even our best efforts may not win the day. Trump comes after Obama, not before. Black Lives Matter develops during the presidency of Barack Obama, not Trump's presidency. History is thick, it's complex, and it's full of contradictions. And for the black humanist, that's all right. You just do what you can do. There's a preoccupation with human history, that experience is key, it is king, and that experience is best evaluated through reason and logic, not through sacred text. Reason and logic. There is, for the black humanist, no special knowledge. Right? And so for the black humanist, the Bible is a wonderful piece of literature, but it's no more telling than A Raisin in the Sun, no more telling than Black Boy, no more telling than Beloved. That these are stories that were written from the context of a physical world that is yours, as opposed to a text written for a different community, based upon borrowed and tied together bits of information. Right? So for the humanist, yeah, the Bible has some significance. It's a piece of literature that ought to be appreciated as a piece of literature, but there are other pieces of literature that tell our story in a more compelling fashion. As these sensibilities grow, as you move out of the early and mid-1800s into the late 1800s, start of the 1900s, these sensibilities become more vocalized, presented in a much more public fashion. So you're moving away from the blues, you're moving away from these individual, anecdotal pieces of information. You're moving away from black folk tales and black folk wisdom, like the Brer Rabbit stories. Are you familiar with Brer Rabbit? Well, there's one in particular, right, that for me speaks to these humanist sensibilities, and it goes something like this. Brer Rabbit encounters the horse and is just deeply jealous. It's like, this horse has this wonderful tail, it's good for swatting flies, it keeps things away. This is just a wonderful thing. And Brer Rabbit, like, I want one of these. So Brer Rabbit goes to the big house. Right? You get a sense of when these are written, right? Goes to the big house. and has a conversation with God and says, look, I want a long tail like this one, right? Because that one swats flies, it keeps things away. It's just really useful. Rather than what I have, I want one of these. And God says, okay, a series of quests that Bro Rabbit has to fulfill. And it involved things like getting the tears of Brother Crocodile. So none of this was easy. But Bro Rabbit is determined because that tail is nice and he's going to get one. Fulfills this, does everything God requires, goes back to the big house, tells God, I did everything that you said I had to do. Everything you said to get you, I have. God gets angry, starts throwing thunder and lightning, chasing Bro Rabbit away, and as Bro Rabbit is running, he hears God in the background saying, if you so smart, get your own long tail. Now, lots of my colleagues will read this as a critique of white supremacy, a critique of white privilege, and a need to understand the ingenuity and creativity of black folks. And that's certainly one way to read it, but it also seems to me that it says something that signifies this concept of God and what you can rely on divinity to do for you. Bro Rabbit, whatever he wants, he's going to have to get. It's not a gift from the divine. Bro Rabbit has to get it. You so smart, get your own long tail. But we're moving from these sorts of examples of the sensibilities that come to frame what we mean by black humanism in the 21st century, and we begin to get things that are more grounded or more public. And this really comes to a head in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. One example of this is the move of black folks into the Communist Party. And in moving into the Communist Party, these black communists are deeply critical of the black church, deeply critical of their theology, and much more concerned with what black folks ought to be doing to change their economic circumstances on their own. Deeply critical. In addition to black communists, you get the Harlem Renaissance. And there's a poetic expression of this counter way of being in the world, right? With the Harlem Renaissance, it's a rethinking of black life that argues that our humanity is not simply captured by pointing out the best of our doings, the best of our behavior, right? So it's not apologetic in that sense. It's not the kind of work you'll get from a Frederick Douglass, a very different take on the world, that to be human is to achieve, but it's also to be messy. And so the Harlem Renaissance presents black life in a way that is messy. But some of the figures within the Harlem Renaissance, like James Weldon Johnson, who wrote God's Trombone, also in his memoir argued that he let go of the concept of God years before he had finished his formal education and moved into his public life, given up on that. But this is a man who still writes God's Trombone. And in God's Trombones, he is celebrating the sermonic style, right? This mode of expression that is best captured by the black preacher. But for him, this has cultural worth. It has no theological significance. He has let go of the idea of God, but still understands and celebrates the culture of black life. This is a very different relationship to black church. It's not a buying of the theological concepts. It's a recognition of the role of the black church in the pushing forward of black culture. It's the language, it's the grammar, it's the creativity, not the theological concepts. Zora Neale Hurston, another prominent figure during the Harlem Renaissance, argues that, she ain't about prayer, that prayer is for the weak. For her, prayer is for the weak. See, I don't think y'all believe me, so I'm gonna read what she says. I do not pray. I accept the means at my disposal for working out my destiny. Prayer is for those who need it. Prayer seems to me a cry of weakness, an attempt to avoid by trickery the rules of the game as laid down. I do not choose to admit weakness. I accept the challenge of responsibility. So it's a simple question. Could she have said that in the context of the black church and it been understood as theistically oriented? No. So she's got a very different way of thinking about this. Now, Zora Neale Hurston never said, I'm a humanist, but her sensibilities are deeply in line with what we've come to call black humanism. you also get explicit examples of this that not only entail a rejection of otherworldly theological claims, but a rethinking of what it means to be together, what it means to undertake ritual structures. Egbert Brown lived in Harlem, was a minister in the Unitarian Church, and argued that what needs to happen in Harlem is a way of getting together, a church body that is not dominated by theological claims, but is committed to reason and logic, that is not God-centered, not God-driven, but celebrates human ingenuity, creativity, and works premised upon reason and logic. Again, he didn't call himself a humanist, but the sensibilities he establishes in this Harlem church in the 1930s speak to what we've come to call humanism and would ring true for black nuns who claim to be humanist. There's another movement during the 20th century, black realism, and this includes figures like Richard Wright, Nella Larson, Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin. All of those figures are critical of the assumptions made within the context of the black church, deeply critical of the theological claims being made by the black church. See, I don't think y'all believe me, so I'm gonna read. This is Richard Wright. Richard Wright is one of my favorite authors. I think his work is just mind-blowing. It is just deep. And it made sense in the mid-20th century, and it makes sense in the 21st century. It is just profound. And here, this is from a memoir, sort of, kind of, titled Black Boy, right? It's sort of, kind of a memoir, not in a strict sense, but you get some sense of who Richard Wright is. And in this, he's talking about his grandmother, who was a wonderful woman, but she was strict and all about church. And he wanted to try to please her, right? He really wasn't into this church thing, but he wanted to please her, so he's going to give it a try. It's not just his grandmother, though. It's some of his young friends who, given themselves to Christ, had gone to church, and now they're trying to lead him that way, bring others. And Richard Wright is trying, right? He wants to make folks happy, so he's going to church. And he says this, reflecting on that experience. Many of the religious symbols appealed to my sensibilities, and I responded to the dramatic vision of life held by the church, feeling that to live day by day with death as one's sole thought was to be so compassionately sensitive toward all life as to view all men as slowly dying, in the trembling sense of fate that welled up sweet melancholia from the hymns blended with the sense of faith that I had already caught from life. But full emotional and intellectual belief never came. He liked the music. It spoke to him. But full emotional and intellectual belief never came. Perhaps if I had caught my first sense of life from the church, I would have been moved to complete acceptance. But the hymns and the sermons of God came into my heart only long after my personality had been shaped and formed by uncharted conditions of life. I felt that I had in me a sense of living as deep as that which the church was trying to give me. And in the end, I remained basically unaffected. Didn't work for him. He encountered the world before he encountered the church, and its way of making sense of life did not work for him. James Baldwin. Most folks are familiar with James Baldwin because of the first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain. And they assume that James Baldwin, the young preacher, is James Baldwin 20, 30 years later. But James Baldwin left the church, and his perspective changed. And he's getting ready to meet with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And he's a bit concerned about this because he understands the Nation of Islam's commitment to heterosexual relationships. and their dismissal of homosexuality. So he thinks this is going to be rough. But it's not just sexuality that he thinks will be a difficult conversation. It's religion. He is just concerned that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is going to ask him about his religious beliefs. And in wrestling with that, he tells us that it wasn't church anymore, that writing was his religion. A character in Lorraine Hansberry, A Raisin in the Sun, when talking to her mother is talking about what God is doing, what God is going to do. And this young woman says, you know, she is tired of God getting credit for what people do. Nella Larson in the novel Quicksand. It doesn't get as much attention as Passing. Was it Netflix that did the movie on Passing? I think it was Netflix. But anyway, it doesn't get as much attention as Passing. But in Quicksand, it's the story of Helga Crane, the tragic mulatto figure, right? I mean, she's writing during this period of Black realism. The tragic mulatto figure is a key figure within this literature. And this figure is having a difficult time. She doesn't fit in either world, right? She does not fit in either world. That's why it's called the tragic mulatto. Doesn't fit in either world. And she's just, the trauma of this, she's hit a low point. And she's wandering around Harlem in the rain. And she hears this sound coming from a church. She goes in and has this traumatic experience. She ends up marrying the minister and moving south with him, and she's trying very hard to fit in, and things are now going well. The women in the church can't really get with her. They don't like her. Things are not going well. Her health is deteriorating. She's having child after child. Her body is being compromised, and she's having a difficult time. She's trying to make this thing make sense. She's praying and praying and praying, and she reaches a point where she says she understands why her prayers aren't being answered. Because there is no God. So again, these examples of Black folks who in public develop a grammar and vocabulary of life that are devoid of the God concept, deeply critical in public of the God concept. And this continues during later in the 20th century. And when we think civil rights movement, we tend to think church, and we think theists who are operating in accordance with their faith, trying to bring about the kind of justice that God demands. So we think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, yeah? And we probably think the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, 1963, right? But what we often fail to account for is that there is no March on Washington without A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph, who was a union organizer, right, was doing this work. There is no movement and there is no march without him. He was a non-believer. For him, paying church tithes was like paying his union dues. It wasn't a theological dictate. It was, this is what you do for organizations. James Foreman, who marches into Riverside Church in New York City, takes the pulpit and calls churches in the United States out, reminds them that they have benefited from the misery of Black folks. Yeah? They have benefited from the misery of Black folks. Not indirectly, directly benefited from the misery of Black folks. And he says, it's time to pay what you owe. And so he outlines a program, the kind of money that churches had to give to the Black movement as a matter of repentance. And this shook churches up. Even deeply liberal movements like the Unitarian Universalist Association, right? And that is liberal with 2 capital L's, right? Deeply liberal, that some folks within that movement believe in God, some don't. There's kind of, it's an openness. It's based upon these principles that are ethically driven as opposed to doctrinally driven. They got together and decided, okay, we got to figure out what we're going to do with this money. We got to give this money. He is right. We got to give this money. provides this critique called the Black Manifesto. What we fail to recognize is that James Forman, in his autobiography, argued he didn't believe in God, didn't believe in God. Black Panthers, Huey Newton. Huey Newton argued, look, we partner with churches, we make use of churches because they provide space, resource, and effective communication strategies. You can get word out through the church. Church has some money, has physical space. But he argued belief in God was a matter of a lack of knowledge, and that as our knowledge increased, the need for reliance on a divine being would decrease. For him, belief in God was an indication of human ignorance, a lack of knowledge, and that as knowledge grew, this commitment to the divine would decrease. Example after example of black folks who are arguing for a way of meaning making, of wrestling with the fundamental questions of our existence. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? That is not tied to a sense of the divine. Again, these folks predate the use of this label, black humanism, but their sensibilities are deeply in line with humanism. As we move into the 21st century, you get more of this. You get President Obama including non-believers in his inauguration speech. This had never happened before, right? That he expands the possibilities of authentic life within the context of the United States to include non-believers. You have Black Lives Matter that understands the utility of a range of orientations. It's not Christian, but it's not opposed to Christianity. It's not atheistic, but it's not opposed to atheism. It understands that there is a shared agenda that can be utilized and used regardless of what one believes or doesn't believe. It's a way of thinking about engagement in the world, a kind of faithful engagement in the world that does not require doctrinal agreement. And then most recently, black humanists who've labored alone in some cases have decided that it's really time to form communities, that black non-believers can have a difficult time. They're signing up for yet another form of disregard, right? To be black in an anti-black world, to be a woman in a gender-biased world, to be trans in a world that doesn't know what to do with you, and to add to that another despised category, right? Because you've got folks like Oprah Winfrey and Steve Harvey, who've raised questions concerning the ability of non-believers to move through the world in a way that is moral and ethical. You take on another form of disregard, another way to be marginalized. So black folks who are non-believers have decided we have to give folks a soft place to land. And so now you get organizations, sure enough organizations like Black Non-Believers, headquartered in Atlanta with branches throughout the country that is about celebrating their non-belief, providing ritual structures that allow folks to form communities that are for them authentic. So we've reached a point in the 21st century when we think in terms of how black folks make life meaningful, we cannot restrict our thinking to what takes place within black churches, because there's a growing number of black folks who claim not the church, but claim humanism, free thought, skepticism, atheism. And the question becomes, how do we move through this world in a way that is authentic, that is creative, that is imaginative, mindful of this sort of complexity and the contradictions it imposes? Should we talk?
Wanted to also take this time, there's a lot out there. Wanted to open the floor for questions, create kind of a dialogue with some of the things that was brought up, maybe some things in between the lines that you didn't hear that you would like to kind of extract a little bit. So if you don't mind, if I could jump in first, and
Go
then
ahead.
I'll pass the mic.
Do you?
How does one decide IAU to study Black humanist?
For me, it's two reasons. It is professional and it is personal. My personal orientation is secular humanism, right? So I am a humanist. So it's personal on one level. In the same way that a whole lot of my colleagues who study Black religion do it because they're church folks and they want to better understand their orientation. So for me, that is one reason. But secondly, it is a significant strand of thought within Black history. And I don't know that we can fully understand how Black folks have envisioned the world and attempted to change it without understanding some of these more marginalized modes of thought and ways of being. That we miss something about what it means to be Black in the context of the United States if we don't explore this orientation. And within the context of the 21st century, it seems to me there is no legitimate reason not to, when you've got a significant percentage of the Black population saying, no, church thing, mosque thing, that stuff's not me. I don't do that. To understand the Black community and its complexities has to involve understanding these folks as well.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, there's some emotion happening right now, but
Oh my God. Oh. I don't know. I don't even know. Go, you go.
Okay. You mentioned this, I think indirectly earlier, but I have been thinking about the role of trauma and trauma response in the development of humanism, especially Black humanism. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what you've encountered in your studies and things like that, because clearly, Black people are talking about, like, I don't do church, right? In the quote that you shared earlier from Mr. Payne, I think, who said, I asked this guy what church he went to, and he said, if the white folk do it, that's not for me, right? So a lot of that, it would seem to me, and from what you shared, is rooted in trauma, right? Like, you're not going to participate in the thing that was weaponized against you. And so I'm just curious to see what you've encountered in your research and study about the relationship between trauma response and the increase in Black humanism.
My argument would be, on some level, trauma doesn't become the most effective way to distinguish this population, right? Because I would argue that the development of the Black church involves a response to trauma. And it gets situated in a particular question. What can you say about God in light of human suffering in the world? It's the question of theodicy, or the problem of evil, right? And so Black folks within the church have tried to reimagine themselves, rethink themselves in light of two forms of trauma. The first is their initial creation, that humans are flawed, incapable. And then their second creation as Blacks within a context of an anti-Black world. And church becomes a way to address that trauma. Now, here's the issue, that within the context of the Black church, for example, there are Black folks who have encountered tremendous misery and suffering, yeah? And coming out of that can involve a certain form of trauma. But for me, it is not, that's not all there is. Because we also have, so yes, there is this element of trauma, that Black folks coming out of the church who are rejecting the God idea are trying to get over some of the misery, some of the contempt that they experience within the church. Yeah. But it extends, right? Because for a whole lot of these folks, leaving the church became synonymous with leaving Blackness. They had to surrender their Black card. Right, and it's one thing to be in the context of the church and understood as a sinner, because everybody is, right? But it's another to leave that and have the attack on one's personhood multiplied, right? So there are Black folks coming out who have experienced this sort of religious trauma, but there's also a significant number of Black humanists who have no connection to black church, have never, right? They came out of secular homes. Like Mandisa Thomas, who's the founder and former president of Black Nonbelievers. She was born into a secular home. And so religious trauma, what? Right? Because she was raised secular. So I think there's some complexity there in terms of how black folks encounter humanism and encounter theism. And so I want to work to maintain that complexity.
Yeah, that's huge.
Because for me, part of the issue has been, for some folks, they will take this idea of religious trauma and say, okay, they really weren't rejecting the church. They were rejecting the bad behavior of someone in the church. No, that's not really what they're doing. Right? And so folks will, just on a personal level, folks have come up to me and say, okay, you must have asked God for something, didn't get it. Right? Was there a death in your family and this is you being angry? I said, no, life was pretty good. Life was, I did all right for a black man in an anti-black world. I did all right. So no, this was not personal. It was a matter of, is theism serving the needs of this larger black community? And from my vantage point, it was not. Right? So folks are coming from this from different perspectives and based upon different experiences. And so I work to maintain that complexity.
I appreciate that. That helps me reframe my thinking, right? Because as I was reflecting on what you were sharing, I was like, my question just now, really minimized the humanism movement in general, and especially among black humanism, right? Because if I'm thinking of black humanism only as a response to trauma, one, that doesn't capture everyone who identifies as a black humanist, right? But that also removes it's an attempt at removing the validity and the value of black humanism if I can only understand it in relation to its development as a trauma response, and that's not the case at all. Yeah, so I appreciate you lifting that up.
Yeah, it becomes difficult to see the positive and proactive dimensions of black humanism. We only see it in terms of critique and negation, which again serves to center the black church, but in a very different way. Right, that they're only leaving because they encountered a flaw in this, when there's more to it than that.
Right. They don't just need to be in a different and cooler costume.
Right. That's not going to solve it.
Yeah.
Because
I need 3 to 5 business days to process.
So bringing this back to a higher education context, can you talk about how the black humanists are either organizing or being received on college campuses, and what are they seeing as we're talking, I guess, in a traditional sense of 18 to 20, 22 to 23-year-olds, what are they seeing as a means for organizing and gathering, and how is that playing out in contrast, right, to other faith-based organizations, and how are they looking at each other, if you have any?
Yeah, it seems to me in terms of black humanism that this idea that we need these sorts of infrastructures, right, that are about the effective dimensions of life is fairly recent. And so, for example, you're just over the past couple of decades getting a noteworthy number of humanist chaplains, for example, right? So it wasn't that long ago that Greg Epstein started at Harvard and then MIT, or Chris Stedman was at Yale and is now at Augsburg University, right? This is a fairly new development within the context of humanism in general, and rather undeveloped in terms of black students on HBCUs or PWIs, right? That this really hasn't developed in a robust way yet. One of the primary modes of organizing in terms of student organizations is the Secular Student Alliance, but that is primarily a white organization at this point, trying to figure out how to do this differently. And some of this may change because, for example, in Texas, there's Dr. Will Judy, who is on the Secular Student Alliance board and understands the need to diversify that organization to reach a more diverse population on university campuses. So just in terms of my own campus, they have not organized. Sam Houston has a SSA chapter that is led by a black student, but it's new, it's fairly new. So this is still beginning to unfold. We're decades behind how dominant denominations have done this work on campuses.
If I can ask a follow-up, in contrast to that, what is the church response to, or maybe not. Let's not speak for the church, but let's not speak for the church. But how is the church being affected by what's happening with the Black humanist specifically movement?
Well, let's think in terms of black nuns, that if churches are honest, they are experiencing a decline, that there are generations they have not figured out how to reach, right? They have not figured out how to reach them, And simply introducing hip hop's not going to get it done, right? They have not figured out how to reach them. I'm not quite certain that most black churches have wrapped their minds around the idea of black disbelief. There are some noteworthy examples, like Reverend Dr. Brad Braxton. He's president of Christian Theological Seminary in Chicago, but he's also the pastor of the Open Church. And the Open Church is precisely that. It is welcoming of folks of all theological perspectives, all theological opinions. They've asked me to present twice. And it wasn't a matter of, let's get enough to be able to dismantle this thing. It was a genuine conversation, a respect for a position that was not theirs. But I think Braxton's Open Church is an exception to the rule, that black churches, by and large, don't know what to do with this perspective. It runs contrary to everything that has worked for them. Right? That here is a population that can't be enticed by goodies and can't be shamed or scared into participation. What do you do with that population?
It's not really a question. It's more like a. Okay, so I am in church, and when I was in school, there were a lot of folks that they were in like their whole household wasn't really Christian. I noticed that because they thought I was weird, and so we were looking at each other like, y'all are weird. We're looking at me like you're weird. Anyway, so I've realized that there's definitely like a decline, and I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know where they were going, but I have noticed. I want to ask you, are you with so is it the fact that, because I know some people believe in a higher being, but they don't believe in like God per se, but they don't feel like they're the only ones on like in the whole solar system. Is it like that?
Well, yeah, the nuns, it's shorthand for a range of perspectives. And a significant percentage of black nuns, those who respond to surveys, say they do believe in some sort of higher power, but religion doesn't get it. It's spirituality for them. And so for nuns who do hold to a sense of higher power, the structures, the infrastructure of religion doesn't get it. The more fluid and open orientation that is spirituality, that works.
So what do you feel like would get you to come to Christianity, not the church, because a lot of folks, even people who believe in God and Jesus, don't, like the church per se. So what do you feel like for a humanist would get them to come to Christ?
Nothing, right? Because here is an orientation that works for them. For them, there is no lack, right? That this is an orientation that meets all of their needs. Go to church for what? Right? So no, I think one of the things in the context of the United States, what we have to wrap our mind around is not everybody's going to go to church, but it doesn't mean that they are somehow fundamentally flawed, right? That they are morally and ethically lacking. No, they just move through the world in a different way, right? That this has been difficult for us. In a country that didn't until 1957 have "In God We Trust" on the dollar bill, right? This has been difficult in the context of this country. But I think we have to come to grips with the fact that this is a religious landscape that is colored by distinction, contradiction, and fluidity. And I think what becomes important is recognizing that folks need to move through the world in a way that makes moral and ethical sense to them, that allows them to wrestle with the fundamental questions of their existence in a way that is productive and transformative. And that's not going to be church for everybody.
Can I ask, is it fair to draw a parallel correlation, right? It's not the same, but kind of the same. So this idea that black humanists have found an environment, a community that works for them outside of the church, maybe similar to individuals who believe in committed relationships without getting married, right? Like the idea that the construct of a wedding agreement, the institution of a union that is bound by these particular set of rules is unnecessary if we have a contract with one another and we are in this type of relationship that we don't need a band and contracts and that kind of thing. Is that
Well, I would say no, that for the black humanist, it's an alternate commitment. It's an alternate institution. As opposed to the lack thereof, it's just a different one, right? And so you get black humanists who are kind of doing their own thing and don't need that kind of formal community that meets on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. But for others, they do. And they might be part of the Unitarian Universalist Association. They may be involved in the American Humanist Association or Black Nonbelievers or Houston Oasis, right? That there are these communities that provide that alternate contract, that alternate institution, and that works for them.
I guess maybe kind of I'll close unless you have another question. How would someone who were interested in learning more or connecting with the black humanist community, like where does one go to find this?
Several locations.
Like
Yeah.
outside of Google,
Yeah.
right? Like
I'll start with the most immediate. Tomorrow, Central Standard Time from 8 until 5 is the inaugural conference of the Black Humanist Studies Association. It is online. If you go to Black Humanist Studies org, all of the information about registering is there, and it is a day-long series of panels devoted to better understanding the nature and meaning of black humanism. Outside of that, a good place to start is Houston Oasis, in this context is Houston Oasis. Also, Black nonbelievers online, it's easy to get information from them. Formal materials, publications are just a click away.
Yeah. All right. Last question.
You briefly talked about James Baldwin. I went to LSCC in Chicago, so
Okay.
took lots of courses at CTS. And anyways, James Baldwin, in the context of my seminary courses, right, working with Reverend Dr. Linda Thomas, right, she's a
I know her
womanist.
well.
And, yeah, she's.
I've known her for 30 plus years.
I hope that I can know her for as long. So we read, one of the first books we read in the public church class that we took with her was The Fire Next Time, right? And so that was my first introduction to Baldwin, right? And so I have always understood Baldwin to be a Christian theologian, doing this. And it was only until I was in New Orleans in July this summer, and I stopped. There's a little coffee shop bookstore called Baldwin and Co., and they're dedicated to celebrating the works of James Baldwin. And I picked up his biography, and I just had no idea. So my question for you, where in James Baldwin's works do you really start to see that shift away from Christianity and religion in general? This is just for my own personal
Everything after Go Tell It on the Mountain.
Everything after the first one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a different world he's entertaining, and there's no reliance on these theological categories that inform Go Tell It on the Mountain. But you even get hints in Go Tell It on the Mountain. If his motivation for ministry is pragmatic, it allows him to one-up his father, right? Gain the upper hand on his father. This is rather pragmatic. And even his sensibilities within the church run contrary to the theology of that church. Right? His desires, its interests run contrary to the church. James Baldwin also says, look, growing up in Harlem, you had to belong to something. That's just the nature of life in Harlem. You could belong to the pimps, you could belong to the drug dealers, the number runners, had to belong to something. He encounters a minister who asks, whose little boy are you? And this kind of prompts these questions. For him, James Baldwin argued it was better to belong to the church than to the pimps, the number runners, or the drug dealers. This is rather pragmatic. That even that experience, right, when he's slain in the spirit on the floor, the way in which he describes that is erotic, it's sensual, it ties into our physicality, it has nothing really to do with vertical relationships. He is wrestling with his father, and he's wrestling with his desires in that. Right? So it seems to me Baldwin gives us these sorts of hints, but we have used a hermeneutic. That is to say, we have used an interpretive tool that assumes Christian commitment. This is why we assume that W.E.B. Du Bois was a churchman, because he wrote about the church. No, W.E.B. Du Bois was not, and he was not. He was an agnostic who understood the church as a cultural institution. But he did not embrace it theologically. But we assume he wrote about the church. You don't write about the church unless you belong to it. But I write about the church. I've written a good number of books about the church. I don't belong to it. Right? We can understand. So there's an assumption that to express an interest in the church, to write about it, is to belong to it, right? That only folks who belong to it have a right to exercise that kind of curiosity, as opposed to assuming that the church is a cultural institution and a business, and that there are reasons to explore and explain this thing whether you buy its theology or not. Because we might then, rather than assuming, right, so here's the issue for me. On one level, I think there's a fair amount of head scratching when it comes to, for example, the Supreme Court's ability to monitor its own ethical engagements. right? That we need some sort of external, but when it comes to the black church, we allow it to set the narrative. We allow it to set the narrative and assume there's something wrong with our analysis if it is inconsistent with the narrative provided by the church. But if we explore the church in ways that are thoughtful and respectful but critical, we might come up with other things. So for example, and then I'll end this, just for example, I'm hard pressed to think of very many black churches that would say they are not concerned with the communities in which they find themselves, that they want those communities revived, yeah? So my thing is this, okay, pay property taxes. If churches pay property taxes, how much money goes into pay property taxes? Right, and they said, well, we don't have to. I've been told we don't have to. Yeah, that money goes into local infrastructure, pay property tax, and say, well, we don't have to. Say, but if this is really your concern, take that money that you would have had to pay in property taxes, put that aside and give it to the community. It seems to me that's a reasonable argument because it pushes against the assumption of specialness. Right? In a country that has separation of church and state, it's a specialness. But it seems to me that kind of engagement with the black church tradition is not going to come from within the black church tradition because it assumes this specialness. Pay the property taxes. That would mean a whole lot, right? You're talking about new books in schools. Pay the property taxes.
I had a question, but I do got a question about that. Don't you think it's better to, because most churches that I've seen, they do drives, they do food drives, clothing drives, stuff like that. It's more local. You don't think that would help more than the taxes?
Deeply insufficient, right? That for me, it's putting a Band-Aid on the problem. From my vantage point, it's like winning the lottery. That within the context of life for that individual, that might have significance, but it does nothing to change the dynamics of capitalism that result in the problem.
And I have one more question too. Mm-hmm. So, does the humanist, do they believe in demons and whatnot? Like,
no.
My people are from New Orleans, and they'll tell you any day they can put a spell on you and make you fall in love. And,
no.
and you know, and so I wanted to know, like, so y'all don't believe in that? If somebody tells you they're a witch and they can make you love this girl right here, you're not going to believe them? Nope.
No. Right? Because for the humanists, there is no logical or rational reason to believe in these forces, that this is a cultural conversation. It has to do with the kind of cultural narratives that we have produced in order to explain the unexplainable, but that doesn't make it real. Right? And I don't know that all Christians even
Y'all don't believe in possessions either?
How could I? Right? If these things don't exist, how could I?
From that perspective, like what would distinguish a like demonic possession from someone just making hateful choices? Maybe that's not a fair comparison, right? But that's what comes to mind for me, right?
Yeah. There are lots of ways to explain these things. So for example, take Harriet Tubman, who had these visions, right? These trances, and folks said, this is connection with the divine, right? That there was something special that came, visions that came out of these periods in which she was just. Well, but we also know that she experienced trauma. Remember that as a small child, she is hit in the head and it knocks. So there are medical.
Traumatic brain injuries.
Yes, there are medical reasons for these episodes that Harriet Tubman had. So for my thing is, a lack of knowledge is not proof of cosmic forces. It's proof of a lack of knowledge.
Right.
Pardon?
the moms back in the day always would teach their sons, if a girl cooks you any red
Yeah,
sauce,
yeah, yeah, I
don't
know.
eat it. So you would eat a girl's red sauce. It wouldn't have been lasagna, whatever. You don't care. You're not afraid.
See,
Yes.
we're recording, so I don't want to go too deep into that. But
Oh, sorry.
but there, I say in general, I tend not to eat with folks I don't really know,
Okay.
Yeah.
right? So, but they're based upon the way my mother told that there would be reasons outside of any kind of special power or spell.
Right.
There might be other things, and that, yeah.
Okay. That's it. I'm done.
Yeah, but there are other things, right? So I grew up, my grandmother was sure enough Christian, but I remember being told, be careful with your nail clippings. Y'all weren't told this? Be careful with your nail clippings, because folks can do things with your nail clippings. Or be careful with the hair, right? If haircut, burn that. Just don't throw it away, because folks can do, right? So I grew up hearing these things, but for me, I think there is power of persuasion. So if you believe in demons, they're real to you, right? If you believe in these spells, they're real to you. I don't, so for me, they're not real.
Right. Well, because again, these are all ways of attempting to make sense and meaning out of the world as each individual person or like different like groups of people and cultures have experienced.
Yeah,
right?
to
So, like,
explain.
There's a reason like all of these like
Yeah,
wives' tales and whatever have been around, and just the stories that we have been taught. Those have come from places, and it's come from people and cultures who, at the time, that was how they made sense of the world as they were
yeah.
experiencing.
To explain the unexplainable.
Right. And so humanism is another way of like understanding and experiencing and interpreting the world and like making meaning of it, if I am understanding correctly.
Yeah. It's a life orientation. Some would say a philosophy of life. I'll call it a life orientation that does for humanists what churches do for black theists.
Well, thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Penn, for today. Thank y'all for being here. Absolutely, we can continue this conversation. We could probably keep going, right, if we need to, but he's, the hour from Houston to Houston, he's got to get back. And we got other things going on. So appreciate y'all being here. We'll definitely make sure you get connected, and we'll transfer some information. And thank you, Dr. Penn, again.
Thank you.
And we'd love to have you back talking either about this again or something else.
Anytime.
But this was wonderful.
Anytime.
Thank you definitely so much. All right.